Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that 80% of your income just disappeared. Not slowly, not with warning, just gone. Because the person writing those checks decided they don't need you anymore. That's what's happening to Canada right now. For decades, Canada built its entire economy around one customer. One buyer who took almost everything Canada produced. Cars, steel, lumber, energy, 80% of everything Canada sold went to one place, the United States. And then, in January 2026, Canada's Prime Minister flew to Beijing to find new customers. And while he was there, shaking hands in China, the President of the United States stood in a Michigan factory and said 6 words that changed everything. We don't need their product. This isn't a trade dispute. This is a breakup. And Canada is about to learn a very expensive lesson about what happens when your best customer walks away. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you'll understand exactly how a single trip to China triggered the collapse of the world's most integrated trading relationship, and why what's happening to Canada right now might be the template for what happens to allies everywhere in the New World Order. Part 1. The perfect customer: how Canada built an economy around one buyer. Let me tell you about the most successful business relationship in modern history. For over 3 decades, Canada had something most countries dream about. A customer so reliable, so massive, so close, that planning your entire economy around them felt like common sense. That customer was the United States. And the relationship was so good, so smooth, that Canadians forgot it was even a risk. Here's the number that explains everything. Roughly 80% of everything Canada exports goes to the United States. 80%. Cars from Ontario, oil from Alberta, lumber from British Columbia, steel from Quebec. 4 out of every $5 Canada makes from selling stuff to the world comes from one buyer. Think about that for a second. If you ran a business and 80% of your revenue came from a single client, you'd be terrified. You'd know that losing that client would destroy you. But Canada didn't feel terrified. They felt safe. Why? Because this wasn't just any customer. This was the neighbor next door. The customer you shared a language with, shared a culture with, shared the longest undefended border in the world with. The customer who needed what you had and who made it incredibly easy to sell it to them. After the Cold War ended, the world globalized fast, and Canada and the United States signed the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, in 1994. Later, in 2020, it was updated and renamed USMCA, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. In Canada, they call it CUSMA. Same deal, different acronym. And that deal was a masterpiece of integration. It didn't just lower tariffs, it erased them for most goods. It synchronized regulations. It made supply chains flow across the border like water. A car part could cross between Canada and the US 7 times before the car was finished, and nobody even blinked. This was more than a trade deal. It was a promise, a framework. It said, we're in this together. You make parts, we assemble them. You grow wheat, we buy it. You pump oil, we refine it. Friction was almost invisible. Trade became automatic. And for Canada, that felt like winning. Why diversify when you've got the richest customer on earth living next door, locked into a treaty, buying everything you make? Why risk new markets when the old one works perfectly? But here's the thing about efficiency. It's the opposite of resilience. Canada talked about diversification for years. Politicians gave speeches about it. Think tanks wrote reports. We need to reduce our dependence on the US market, they said. We need to find new customers in Asia, in Europe, in Latin America. But talking isn't doing. And Canada never actually did it. Because why would they? The US was right there. The infrastructure was already built. The relationships were already established. Diversifying meant risk. It meant cost. It meant competing in markets where Canada had no advantages and plenty of competitors. So Canada stayed put, comfortable, dependent, calling the United States not just a trading partner, but our best customer. And that's the exact phrase that matters. A customer, not a permanent partner, not a guaranteed buyer, a customer. And customers can leave. There were warning signs, small ones at first. Political rhetoric in the US started shifting. America First became a slogan. Reshoring manufacturing became a talking point. The idea that trade deals were bad deals, that allies were taking advantage, that dependence was weakness, started spreading. But Canada kept operating as if the fundamentals wouldn't change, as if the relationship was too deep, too beneficial to both sides, too stable to collapse. This is the setup for every economic disaster in history. Mistaking efficiency for safety, mistaking routine for permanence, mistaking a good customer for a guaranteed one. Canada built an economy around one buyer because it made sense in the short term. And now, in 2026, that decision is about to cost them everything. Because the customer just got a better offer, or decided they didn't need Canada at all. And Canada is about to find out what happens when 80% of your income walks out the door. Part 2. The hinge moment. Carney's Beijing gamble. January 13th, 2026. Prime Minister Mark Carney's plane touches down in Beijing. This is the first visit by a Canadian leader to China in 8 years. 8 years of frozen relations. 8 years of tension over arrests, espionage accusations, political interference. 8 years of cold shoulders and cancelled trips. And now, suddenly, Canada is back. Carney didn't just show up for a handshake. He came with a plan, a big one. He called it recalibrating the Canada-China relationship. He framed it as pragmatic engagement. But what he was really doing was placing a bet. The bet was this: Canada could build a new economic future that didn't depend on the United States, and China would be the centerpiece. Here's what Carney's government announced. They wanted to double non-U.S. exports over the next decade. Double. That's not tinkering at the margins. That's a complete strategic pivot. The goal wasn't just to reduce dependence on the U.S. It was to transform Canada's economy from one built around a single partner to one that was, in Carney's words, resilient to global shocks. And China was the key. Energy deals, agricultural exports, green technology partnerships. Carney was there to unlock markets that could absorb Canadian goods at scale. Markets that could replace what the US bought. On paper, it sounded rational. Diversification is smart. Reducing risk is smart. Finding new customers when your biggest one is getting unpredictable is smart. But here's what Carney missed. Timing is everything. And symbols matter. Because this wasn't just an economic trip. This was a geopolitical signal. And Washington was watching. For decades, US foreign policy has been obsessed with one thing: preventing China from becoming the dominant power in the global system. The US has spent trillions of dollars, fought political battles, launched trade wars, all to keep China contained, boxed in, isolated from American allies. And now, Canada, America's closest ally, its most integrated trading partner, the country it shares a continent with, just flew to Beijing to cut deals. From Ottawa, this looked like pragmatism. From Washington, it looked like betrayal. Think about the optics. Carney is in Beijing shaking hands with Chinese officials while back home, the US is trying to build a coalition against China, while the US is restricting technology exports to China, while the US is telling every ally, you're either with us or against us. And Canada just chose door number 3. We're going to play both sides. Except in the world that's emerging in 2026, there is no door number 3. Carney's visit was scheduled to last until January 17th. 4 days of meetings, announcements, photo ops. 4 days of Canada telling the world, we're done being dependent on the US. And that message landed, loud and clear, in exactly the wrong place. Here's the speculation part, and I'll label it clearly. Did Canada underestimate how politically sensitive this move would be in Washington? Did they think the US would just shrug and say, sure, diversify, no problem? Did they believe the relationship was strong enough to survive Canada, cozying up to America's biggest rival? If they did, they were catastrophically wrong. Because Carney's Beijing trip didn't just signal diversification, it signaled something much bigger. Canada was preparing for a post-American future, a future where the US wasn't the center of gravity anymore, a future where Canada could chart its own course, align with whoever offered the best deal, and manage the fallout. That's not pragmatism. That's a divorce announcement. And divorces, especially geopolitical ones, get ugly fast. Part 3. The customer walks away. Washington declares USMCA irrelevant. January 14th, 2026. While Mark Carney is still in Beijing, Donald Trump steps up to a microphone inside a Ford factory in Michigan, and he says the thing that changes everything. We don't need their product. We don't need cars made in Canada. Not, we're concerned about Canada's trade policies. Not, we're reviewing our agreements. Not, we're opening negotiations. Just, we don't need you. And then he went further. He called USMCA, the treaty that's supposed to govern North American trade until at least 2030, irrelevant. He called it transitional. He said it may have outlived its usefulness. This wasn't a negotiating position. This was a public breakup. Let me explain why this moment is so devastating. Trade deals don't just remove tariffs. They create certainty. They tell businesses, if you build a factory here, if you hire workers here, if you invest billions of dollars into supply chains here, the rules won't change overnight. You're safe. You can plan. USMCA was supposed to provide that certainty until 2030. It had a built-in review clause. Every 6 years, the three countries, US, Canada, and Mexico, would sit down and decide whether to renew it for another 16 years or let it expire. That review is scheduled for July 1st, 2026, 6 months away, and Trump just told the world he's not renewing it, or at least he's treating it like it's already dead. This is where the term zombie USMCA comes from. The deal is still technically alive. It's still on the books. Canadian goods still technically have access to US markets under its terms, but nobody believes it's going to last. Nobody thinks the US is going to renew it in July. So now you've got a trade agreement that's legally enforced but practically dead. A zombie, walking around, still moving, but with no future. And that uncertainty is an economic poison. Here's why. Businesses don't invest in zombies. If you're a Canadian company thinking about building a new plant to export cars to the US, are you going to spend $500 million if you think the trade deal might collapse in 6 months? No. You're going to freeze. You're going to wait. You're going to hold off on every major decision until you know what the rules are. And if you're an American company thinking about buying Canadian parts, are you going to lock yourself into a long-term contract if tariffs might skyrocket next year? No. You're going to look for suppliers in the US, or Mexico, or anywhere that feels more stable. This is how trade deals fail long before they're officially terminated. The collapse happens in boardrooms and investment meetings and supply chain decisions. By the time the deal is actually dead on paper, the damage is already done. Trump's Michigan speech did something brutal. It turned the future from certain to uncertain in a single sentence. And uncertainty kills economies. But here's the deeper point. Canada didn't just lose a trade deal, it lost something more fundamental. It lost the assumption that the US wanted what Canada was selling. For decades, the relationship was built on mutual need. The US needed Canadian energy, Canadian resources, Canadian manufacturing capacity, and Canada needed US markets. But Trump's speech reframed that. He said, "We don't need you. We can make our own cars. We can drill our own oil. We can source our own steel and lumber and everything else. You're not essential. You're optional. And if you're optional, you're replaceable." This is the moment the story changes. This isn't about tariffs or trade policy anymore. This is about whether Canada still has a customer at all. Part 4. The stupid prize, economic collateral damage begins. There's an old saying on the internet, play stupid games, win stupid prizes. Canada played the game of diversifying toward China while still depending on the US for 80% of its exports. And now the prizes are arriving. Let's talk about what's actually happening on the ground right now. In early 2026, the United States has already started hitting Canada with tariffs. Not across the board, not on everything, but on the sectors that matter most. Steel, aluminum, lumber, and the big one, automobiles. These aren't small tariffs. These are what analysts are calling devastating duties, double-digit percentages that make Canadian goods instantly uncompetitive in US markets. Now, technically, goods that comply with USMCA rules are supposed to get exemptions. That's the whole point of the deal. But here's the problem. The US is interpreting those rules very, very narrowly. And when there's any ambiguity, they're siding with tariffs. The result? Canada's average trade-weighted tariff on exports to the US has jumped from 0.1% at the start of 2026 to nearly 10% now. Think about that. In a few months, the cost of doing business with your biggest customer increased by a factor of 100. And the pain is concentrating in exactly the place you'd expect, the automotive sector. Canada's auto industry is massively integrated with the US parts. Cross the border multiple times during production. A single car might have components made in 3 different countries before it rolls off the line. The whole system is built on the assumption that the border is frictionless. But now the border has friction, lots of it. And that friction is killing the economics of Canadian auto manufacturing. Trump isn't just raising tariffs. He's openly pushing to reshore all manufacturing back to the United States. His message to American companies is clear: build it here or pay the price. And his message to Canadian factories is just as clear: we don't need you. This is ground zero for the damage. Ontario's auto plants, the suppliers who make parts for Ford and GM and Stellantis, the workers who depend on those jobs, the towns that depend on those workers. And here's the cruel irony. Canada started diversifying to reduce its vulnerability to the US market. But diversification doesn't happen overnight. You can't just flip a switch and start selling cars to China or wheat to India at the same scale you were selling to the US. It takes years to build new supply chains, years to negotiate deals, years to establish relationships and infrastructure and trust. And Canada doesn't have years. The damage is happening now. So what you get is this terrible paradox. Canada is more exposed now than it was before it started diversifying, because it pissed off its best customer without having a replacement ready. Diversification is supposed to be a hedge, a way to spread risk. But if you do it badly, if you do it publicly, if you do it in a way that threatens your biggest partner, diversification doesn't reduce risk, it multiplies it. Did Canada miscalculate the speed of US retaliation? Almost certainly. The assumption in Ottawa seems to have been that the US would grumble, maybe impose a few symbolic tariffs, but ultimately accept that Canada had the right to trade with whoever it wanted. That assumption was wrong, because this isn't about trade. This is about loyalty. This is about alignment. This is about the US deciding that in a world where you're either with us or against us, trying to play both sides is the same as picking the other side. And the prizes for that game are just starting to arrive. Part 5. The divorce, when allies become strategic risks. Let me read you a line from the Eurasia Group's 2026 risk report. The relationship is history, not the relationship is strained, not the relationship is under pressure. History, as in over, finished, gone. That's how one of the most respected geopolitical analysis firms in the world is describing the Canada-US relationship in 2026. And they're not exaggerating, because what's happening between Canada and the United States isn't a policy disagreement. It's not a trade dispute that can be solved with a few tariff adjustments and a new agreement. It's a structural break. Here's the context that makes this make sense. We're living in what analysts call a G0 world. That's a world where there's no single global leader, no dominant power setting the rules, no hegemon keeping order. The US is still the most powerful country, but it's no longer powerful enough to enforce a global system. China is rising but not dominant. Europe is fragmented. And everywhere you look, countries are being forced to choose sides. In that world, the US has a very simple calculus. You're either with us, fully and completely, or you're a strategic risk. There's no middle ground. There's no we'll trade with both of you. There's no we'll stay neutral. Because neutrality, in a world splitting into blocks, is just another word for unreliable. And Canada just made itself unreliable by flying to Beijing, by announcing a plan to double non-US exports. By framing China as a strategic partner, Canada sent a message to Washington: we're hedging our bets. We're not sure you're going to be the dominant power in 10 years, so we're making friends with your biggest rival just in case. And Washington heard that message loud and clear. This is where the language of strategic autonomy crashes into the reality of economic dependence. Strategic autonomy means you get to make your own choices. You're not a satellite, you're not a vassal, you're a sovereign country that can chart its own course. And Canada wants that, desperately, especially under a government that sees the U.S. becoming more unpredictable, more nationalist, more willing to throw allies under the bus. But here's the problem. Strategic autonomy requires economic independence, and Canada doesn't have that. 80% of its exports still go to the U.S. Its supply chains are still integrated with the U.S. Its economy is still built around U.S. demand. So when Canada tries to assert strategic autonomy, the U.S. doesn't see a confident ally setting boundaries. The U.S. sees a dependent partner threatening to leave while still living in the house, eating the food and cashing the checks. And the response is brutal. Fine, leave, but you're not taking anything with you. This is the divorce dynamic. And divorces don't end with both sides happy. They end with lawyers and asset division and someone moving out and someone paying the price. Washington has essentially imposed a binary choice on Ottawa. Align with us completely, accept that your foreign policy has to match ours, accept that trading with China means losing access to us, or face complete economic isolation from your best customer. There's no compromise position. There's no, let's work this out. The U.S. is done with the era of quiet alignment, where Canada could mostly do what it wanted, as long as it didn't make too much noise. Now it's loud alignment or nothing, and the tragedy is that Canada doesn't have the economic foundation to say no. It can't afford to lose the U.S. market. Not yet, maybe not ever. So Canada is trapped between a desire for autonomy and the reality of dependence, trapped between a rational strategy of diversification and the political consequences of executing it, trapped between Washington and Beijing with no safe place to stand. The relationship isn't strained, it's history. And history doesn't get rewritten easily. Part 6. The human bill who pays when the best customer leaves. Let's bring this out of the boardrooms and policy papers and into the real world. Because when we talk about trade wars and tariffs and collapsing relationships, it's easy to forget that these are abstractions. Numbers on spreadsheets, percentages in reports. But behind every percentage point is a person, a family, a town. And right now, those people are starting to pay the bill for decisions made in Ottawa and Washington and Beijing. Let's start with the obvious. Jobs. Canada's export economy is geographically concentrated. It's not spread evenly across the country. It's clustered in specific regions that depend on specific industries. Southern Ontario builds cars. Quebec makes steel and aluminum. British Columbia cuts lumber. Alberta pumps oil. The prairies grow wheat. And all of those industries sell primarily to the United States. So when the U.S. raises tariffs, when it threatens to reshore manufacturing, when it says, we don't need your product, the pain doesn't hit all of Canada equally. It hits the workers in Windsor who build transmissions for Ford. It hits the mill workers in Quebec who smelt aluminum. It hits the loggers in B.C. who cut timber. These are communities that have been built around a single industry for generations. Towns where everyone either works at the plant or works at a business that depends on the plant. Where the tax base comes from the plant. Where the schools and hospitals and roads are funded by the economic activity the plant generates. And now that plant is facing tariffs that make it uncompetitive, or it's facing the threat that its biggest customer is going to build the same thing domestically and stop buying Canadian products altogether. The automotive sector is ground zero. Canada's auto industry employs hundreds of thousands of people directly and indirectly, and it's integrated so deeply with the U.S. that any disruption to cross-border trade is catastrophic. We're already seeing it. Investment freezes, companies delaying expansions, suppliers cancelling orders, workers getting told that shifts are being cut, that hiring is frozen, that the future is uncertain. And the worst part? This isn't happening because the industry is failing. It's not happening because demand is down or because the products are bad. It's happening because of a political decision made thousands of miles away. The workers didn't choose to diversify toward China. They didn't fly to Beijing. They didn't make a speech about strategic autonomy. But they're the ones losing their jobs. Then there's the investment freeze. The zombie USMCA problem isn't just theoretical, it's real, and it's stopping capital dead in its tracks. If you're a business trying to decide whether to invest in Canada, you're facing a brutal calculation. Do I put money into a country that might lose access to its biggest market in 6 months? And the answer, increasingly, is no. Foreign investment is drying up. Domestic investment is being delayed. Companies that were planning to expand are hitting pause. Companies that were planning to hire are holding off. Because uncertainty is the enemy of investment. And right now, Canada is drowning in uncertainty. And here's the cruelest part. The benefits of diversification, if they come at all, will arrive years from now. Building new trade relationships takes time. Negotiating new deals takes time. Constructing new supply chains takes time. But the costs are arriving now. So you get this terrible lag, a gap between the pain and the payoff, between the layoffs and the new jobs, between the policy decision and the policy working. And in that gap, people suffer. There's speculation here, and I'll label it. What are the long-term demographic effects? Does this trigger migration out of export-dependent regions? Do young people leave towns that used to have good manufacturing jobs and move to cities? Does regional inequality get worse as some parts of Canada adjust faster than others? And what about the social fabric? What happens to communities when the economic foundation collapses? When the plant closes or shrinks or moves? When the tax base evaporates and the schools lose funding and the hospital cuts staff? These are the questions that don't get answered in trade policy debates, but they're the ones that matter most to the people living through this. This brings us back to the central question of this whole story. Was there a softer landing? Could Canada have diversified without triggering a breakup with the US? Could it have moved slowly, quietly, without making a big public show of flying to Beijing and announcing a radical pivot? Maybe, maybe not. But what's clear is that the way it happened, the timing, the symbolism, the speed, all of it combined to create the worst possible outcome. Maximum pain, minimum gain. Canada is paying the human bill for a geopolitical gamble, and the people writing the check didn't place the bet. Part 7. What happens next? No clean exit. So where does this go from here? If you're hoping for a clean resolution, a happy ending, a moment where everything gets fixed and everyone moves on, I've got bad news. This story doesn't have a clean exit. Let's start with the hard truth. There is no immediate replacement for the US market. China is big. China is growing. China could theoretically absorb more Canadian exports, but China is not going to buy 80% of what Canada produces. It's not going to replace the US as Canada's dominant customer. Not in 10 years. Not in 20. The scale isn't there. The integration isn't there. The infrastructure isn't there. Canada can double its exports to China, and it still won't come close to replacing what it's losing from the US. And that's assuming China even wants to play that role, which is not a given. China has its own agenda, its own priorities. It's not sitting around waiting to be Canada's savior. So option 1, replace the US with China, is not realistic. Option 2, go back to the US and try to repair the relationship. But how do you repair a relationship after you've publicly said you're looking for someone else? After you've flown to Beijing and shaken hands with America's biggest rival? After the US president has stood up and said, "We don't need you"? You can't just apologize and hope it blows over. The damage is done. The signal has been sent. And in geopolitics, signals can't be unsent. The US is not going to trust Canada the way it used to. Not after this. Even if Canada backs away from China, even if it cancels deals and reverses course, Washington is going to remember that Canada tried to hedge. And once trust is broken, it's almost impossible to rebuild. So option 2, fix the relationship, is possible, but deeply uncertain. Option 3, live in limbo. This is the zombie USMCA scenario. The deal doesn't get renewed in July, but it doesn't get officially terminated either. It just kind of lingers, neither alive nor dead. Canada keeps some access to US markets, but with constant threats of tariffs, constant uncertainty, constant political pressure. Businesses operate in a permanent state of anxiety. Investment stays frozen. Growth stalls. This is not a sustainable long-term position, but it might be where Canada ends up anyway. because neither full breakup nor full reconciliation seems likely. And option 4, strategic autonomy becomes real. This is the long game, the decade-long project. Canada accepts that it can't depend on the US anymore and commits fully to building an economy that's diversified across multiple regions: Asia, Europe, Latin America, Africa. It's painful. It's expensive. It requires massive public investment in infrastructure, in trade missions, in subsidies to help industries transition. It means accepting lower growth for years while the new relationships are built. But it's the only path that gets Canada out from under US dominance. The problem? It requires Canada to survive the transition. And right now, it's not clear that Canada's economy can handle the short-term pain long enough to reach the long-term gain. Here's the speculation, clearly labeled, Canada's future might be as a middle power without a guaranteed buyer. In the 20th century, Canada could rely on the US as a stable, massive, predictable customer. That allowed Canada to build an efficient, specialized economy. In the 21st century, that luxury might be gone. Canada might have to operate in a world where no single customer dominates, where every market has to be fought for, where nothing is guaranteed. That's a harder world, a more expensive world, a more uncertain world. But it might be the world Canada is heading toward, whether it likes it or not. And here's the final point. This story is not finished. The USMCA review is in July. The tariffs are still escalating. The diplomatic freeze between Ottawa and Washington is ongoing. The economic damage is still unfolding. We don't know how this ends because it hasn't ended yet. But what we do know is this. Canada didn't lose its best customer overnight. It signaled it might. And the customer listened. That signal, that trip to Beijing, that announcement of a pivot, that was the hinge moment, the point where everything changed. And now Canada is living in the aftermath, trying to figure out how to survive in a world where 80% of your income just became uncertain. There's no clean exit, no easy answer, no way to go back to how things were, just a hard road forward. And the question of whether Canada can walk it without collapsing under the weight of its own choices. That's the story. That's what happens when you lose your best customer. And that's where Canada is right now.